My name is Kelly Forden, and this is Let's Deconstruct a Story, a podcast for the story nerds. Aspiring writers need to understand the components of a good story before they can write one. Choices of point of view, plot, setting, and tone are crucial. In each episode, I'll be interviewing a writer about one of their own stories, which will be available for listeners to read for free on my website before they listen. That's www.kellyforden.com/blog. Or you can just Google Let's Deconstruct a Story and you'll find us on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is produced in collaboration with me. I do this by myself in order to learn more about short stories and connect with other writers. I'm happy to offer this as a service to other writers, but it does cost me a little bit of money. I work with sound engineer Elliot Bansell, who does an amazing job, and I have to pay him for his services. So I would deeply appreciate even the smallest donation if you are enjoying this podcast. You can make the donation on my website. Again, that's www.kellyforden.com. Thank you so much and enjoy the show. Hi, I'm Kelly Forden, and I'm here today with Jason Ockert, and we are talking about his fantastic story, People Machines, which was in storySouth. It just came out.
Yeah, I think it was the beginning of July, so it's been out for about a month or so.
Okay, it's such a great story, and there's so much to talk about. It's one of those stories that I was reading, and I kept thinking, oh my gosh, there's more. I don't know if we can get through it in 45 minutes, but there's so much to unpack.
We for sure try our best. I can be pretty, concise in answering questions, but first thing I want to do is say thank you so much for having me on this podcast. It really means a lot to me that you would invite me to be able to talk about this story. So I appreciate you taking the time to parse through this piece with me. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure. I learned so much from doing this, and especially this story. Okay, so I wanted to start. At first, I thought I would start with the beginning, but I think I want to go back to that first sentence later and just sort of talk about some of the smaller parts of the story and then get into some of the overarching themes. The first question I had was about the unraveling. He talks about what I think is a personal unraveling, but might be an unraveling on a larger scale. But can you tell me a little bit about what is going on in his life in the beginning and the unraveling that's taking place?
Sure. Yeah. This story kind of came to me in two different ways. There was sort of like the national attention of the world around me, and then personal. And so, normally when I'm not certain about how I feel about things that are going on, is I'll kind of chase after them a little bit in story form and try to figure out what is it that I'm interested in, and how do those things guide me as I'm moving along in story. And so for me, this story kind of started with the lizard people, actually. And I thought it was a strange phenomena. And when I looked nationally at these creatures called lizard people, and this fascination with lizard people and humans that were actually lizards. And at first it was a joke. It seemed like a joke because I remember as a kid, that was a jokey thing where there was the show called V. I don't know, I'm dating myself there, but these were, humans that were actually aliens, and they were, taking over. But it seems to me that the shift in a kind of a rise in conspiracy it unsettled me. It has been unsettling me. And so that juxtaposed, that's at the national level, but that juxtaposed with a personal loss, right? I lost my father in 2019, he passed away. I didn't have a particularly good relationship with him. We weren't very close at all. In many ways, he always was a bit of a mystery to me. He was always a kind of a story in and of himself. So I think that as I was trying to sort of parse through and process like the passing of my father, mixed with this strange, belief system that seems to be inculcated in spaces nationally. I don't know. I used those two curiosities to wade into the story, and the unraveling that would then be the quick sort of explication as to what happened to our guy Emery, and how it became sort of the bedrock for his transformation and his ability or inability to try to grapple with his alcoholism.
Right. And okay, so I'm going to just segue into all these small questions first.
Hmm?
So
Sure.
Emery and Ulrich, the names that you chose for those characters, I'm just curious, did they come from anything specific, or did you just pick those names out of thin air, or?
Yeah, I kind of like strange. For better or worse, I've been a fan of strange names. To me, I want that character to, I don't want you to know a whole lot of Ulrichs. I'm sure maybe you do know an Ulrich out there, but I
I
don't.
do not.
You don't know any Ulrichs, yeah. Yeah, no. To be honest, I think they came from thin air. But yeah, to me, I don't know any of them that are there. So yeah, I like to have names that are distinctive. And so for me, what happens then is if you choose a name that's distinctive, you might have a better chance of starting to create characters that also, by attrition, become distinctive themselves. And so,
That's
if
so
I can
smart.
create, if I have
Yeah.
like, yeah, well, I mean, if it's Bob, then like, oh, well, there's Bob.
Right.
I think the challenge is not to do it overly deliberately so that it becomes a caricature, right? And I mean, I think that's the kiss of death in short stories and in writing in general, when you slide into the business of creating caricatures. And this was a challenging story for me in that regard, because I think that, as I was starting to get into Ulrich, as I was starting to kind of like, scratch at the surface of some of these tertiary characters, I wanted to make sure that they were fully rounded. And I didn't want to, create them as like, hey, let's poke fun of that. Like, I never want to wink at the reader and say like, oh, let's look at these clowns. So to me, in some ways it starts with the name, but it really is sort of figuring who they are. And Ulrich's name's changed a couple of times before I sort of landed on that.
Hmm.
So, for me, it just was really like I'm able to better understand and fully see some of the parameters of the story when a character kind of rises off the page for me. And the name helps that.
Yeah, no, that's such a great idea, actually. Of course, because there was so much symbolism in the story and there were so many things to investigate while I was reading, I also investigated those names. So I was just wondering if there was any particular symbolism, but I really like that idea that you use distinctive names, because then you don't associate the name with anything else. Like everybody knows a Bob, so immediately,
Yeah.
their Uncle Bob might come to mind. But yeah,
You
that's
know,
a
Kelly, for me too, so much of writing is like a baton, right? And you're kind of in a relay race, and you're kind of handing a baton as you're trying to escalate the story and move towards that end game that you have with it. And if I'm going to introduce a weird character like Agathocles, and I've just introduced characters that were named like Ben and Frank or whatever, it's a huge jump from like
yes.
Dave to Agathocles. So, but if I've already kind of introduced an oddity in names, then maybe that baton can be handed a little bit better to the real strange, right? The real
Right.
unusual that I'm now gonna try to introduce in the story.
Right. It's kind of like a slow slide into the surreal, if I could say that
Yep.
without lisping. But it is. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're a little bit off balance from the names, from everything that's happening. Okay, so I was really struck by this playing with both hypnosis, the idea of being hypnotized, the
Mm-hmm.
idea of having a job in which you kind of float off, or what he said, I'm a floating man. And
Mm-hmm.
then obviously the altered state of being an alcoholic. So were you just, I'm curious what you were thinking was happening to him in terms of all those things.
In my mind, I was trying to, I guess, inhabit his world to the best of my ability. And in
Mhm.
inhabiting his world, I was inhabiting an echo of my father's world, in that he was an alcoholic. He struggled his whole life. And so, trying to kind of grapple with a disassociation with versions of ourselves, to me, seemed to keep cropping up as who this guy was.
Mhm.
And so for me, like the first thing I wanted to do, one of the things that I do in my own stories, it seems it's valuable to me, is to find work. Like where's the job? I've always found jobs in places of work to be good anchors for stories, and they're normally unusual jobs. But so as I started to think of like the dead-endedness of working a job in which you do not really necessarily need to think, you just kind of like working. What happens? Where do we go? Where do we disassociate? And I think for someone who is uncertain who he is in the new version of himself that he's trying to kind of grapple with. That disassociation became important, and I wanted to sort of have it at the job, and then later we're going to see that disassociation that comes out as the story progresses. But this idea of hypnotism to try to cure addiction, it's a legitimate thing. People do try that, and in fact, my father did try that, and so that was that to me kind of, I saw some sort of parallel between like purposefully trying to shut a version of yourself off, as opposed to like when you're in the space of work, it just kind of you kind of transport yourself else out there. So that was it. Like those things started to kind of like get some energy as I was thinking through the story. And so yeah, I kind of played with that.
And did you have the idea that you might be hypnotized and something else might transpire? Because I was thinking, was he being led in a different direction when he was hypnotized too? You sort of
definitely.
Yeah,
definitely. I mean, because I do think that there was some idea of like, well, if you're an alcoholic and your job is to just not drink, just don't have another drink, and I think that there's a version of you who does drink, and like every day, I think you're kind of reminded that if you slide back into this former version of yourself, then you will have parts of yourself that you will lose. And I think when you do slide, as this character does, then you start making up all kinds of excuses as to like why the slide actually wasn't your fault. And so now you can say like, and so he does. He starts thinking of like at some point as he's working through like some of the circumstances of his life. I think that that moment of hypnotism for him, it gave him a bit of solace that maybe there was something in him that was not turned on, but was turned off. And it's a kind of an excuse to maybe, participate in whatever reckless behavior he's about ready to participate in. So that's what I was aiming for. And I think that, in the first person point of view, hopefully the story kind of comes across as a confessional. And so, as I'm moving in that direction, the reader too starts to question what are these versions of himself, and what will happen when that hypnotist does come back around.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it's like a cognitive dissonance that he has. Did you experiment with other points of view? Or, I mean, it made perfect sense to me, and it seemed fantastic that it was first person. We're about a third of the way through the story, when we find out that he had yelled at them, goddamn lazy ass, no good. So we're kind of lulled into his point of view. And then we find out, wow, okay, this guy's really an awful person. I mean, not awful person, but struggling with an addiction that makes him really mean.
Oh yeah. I mean, for sure. That's one of the challenges with this. I always, when I'm writing, I always look for angles that I haven't really done before. And this is unfamiliar terrain for me. Writing first person, I almost always write in third person, and I almost always write in present tense. So first person, past tense to me was a little different. I don't trust myself when I write first person because I like to have a little bit of an emotional distance from the characters. I feel like I can pop into different heads a little bit more accurately. So when I do a first person, it seems like it can be really heavy. And this story, is definitely that. But that's on one hand. But just going back to sort of like Emery and like, his the caliber of his character, I think that's a hard part too, to kind of like, can we look at a character who is kind of awful, right? And try to see if there's something not necessarily redemptive about that, because I think that's minimalizing it, but like let's look at the ways in which a person can get lost and can be susceptible to conspiratorial theories. And what does that mean? Like how do we figure that out? Is there room for empathy for someone who maybe is in the process of losing their way?
Right. And I think you created that because we're already attached to him, and I was feeling sorry for him when we found out exactly how bad this was for his kids. So I just thought that was pretty masterfully done. When we were just talking, I realized I didn't ask you, for anyone who doesn't know about the lizard people, I should probably say, what were the lizard people, just so they know what's going on there.
Oh yeah, lizard people. I mean, this is just another one of the weird sort of strange things that float into and out of our contemporary times. And I think that there's been a move to suggest that the government has people there that are alien lizards who are controlling, different facets of the world. Like political leaders are not actually people; they're actually lizards, and they're from another planet trying to control the world. And some of these things have been floated as half serious. And to me, I'm an absurdist, right? So for me, when I look at that, there's a level of absurdity to me that has energy in it. And so I think that shift from like, hey, okay, this is a kind of an interesting concept. Let's just use the word interesting there. An interesting concept that's being floated. And back in the day, it was something that was just the stuff of science fiction. It was the stuff of, people who were interested in UFOs, right? It kind of started from that. It goes way back. There's this guy that created this idea for it. So, but when I started to see it kind of coming along, and it seemed like people were putting more stock into it as a possibility, that with a whole host of other kind of conspiracies that were on the rise, I started to think like, well, this isn't laughable. There's an element of like kind of like laughing at this, but there's a kind of a danger too. And so for me, I tried to take the subject very seriously. And while I don't believe in these ideologies, I wanted to sort of like figure out like who would, and how do we not just treat them as sort of like somebody to kind of like point the finger at and laugh at, but let's try to look at like the underlying causes of somebody who's trying very hard to believe in a thing that seems preposterous on the outside.
And how did you come up with the microcosm of the toothpick factory?
Yeah. Well, for me, I've always liked toothpick. I've had toothpicks since I was a kid. So there's something about when I'm writing, I like at least some element of the story to have something that's ubiquitous, that like anybody at any time in their day, they can actually go and they run across something that, that's part of their everyday life. And to me, the toothpick struck me as a perfect type symbol in many ways, because it's something that it's everywhere. And
now I'm never going to use one again, but no.
Right. People are never going to. I've ruined toothpicks for people. So, but, it's interesting to me. I find that kind of stuff fascinating. Because objects carry emotional weight. The other day I was out and I was walking and I was kind of like near the dentist or whatever, and this bird. It was a mockingbird. It just it like dove at me, and it really was. Sometimes the birds come in and you're like, oh, it's going to fly away, but it was like trying to attack me. And I took a step back. And I'm like, what's going on here? So I waited for a minute, and then it kind of circled around, and then it if I wasn't going to move, it was going to bite my eye out or something like that. But right, so once I got out of harm's way, I was clearly near a nest or something. The first thing that came to me, of course, was the birds, right? And I thought of the terror that movie, right? And based, of course, on a book, but that movie kind of instilled in me. And even in this moment of panic, not panic, but like of strangeness, the first thing I came to was something that was art. And that to me, I think, is really awesome. To be able to create something that when you are in that world, that story or that narrative, it becomes a part of the world in which you're living. And I think when you have that, the writer, the artist, they've really been successful, because it's not really about like, hey, Alfred Hitchcock and the shots, but just that concept and how it is now part of your life. And when you can do that, if you can like make the world that you've created on the page somehow crop up in ordinary, everyday kinds of ways, then I think you have a better shot of having that story transcend just the thing that you've created. So for me, I always try to find something in there that I think is going to be uber relatable, because if I'm going to ask you to believe in something that's not relatable at all, I'm gonna have to do the work of it at first getting you into that space of familiarity before I can defamiliarize. And so to me, it's in my wheelhouse, right? Toothpicks are in my wheelhouse.
Right.
And working dead-end jobs, that's in my wheelhouse, right? And writing about, broken men, wheelhouse. So those things are all like, I use that as kind of like, that's the solid ground that I try to then, trick the reader into to walk in with me into the unfirm ground, the stuff that I don't know anything about, and that's the thing that I try to build out into the thinner part of the branch.
So is that in your background? Then you've worked in a factory setting before as well?
Yeah, I started working when I was pretty young. I was like 12 when I started, working just jobs. And this was in South Florida. I was born in Indiana, and then I moved down to South Florida when I was like 10 or 11 years old. And I just started working early. I
Hmm.
worked for, a diner. I worked worked in construction, worked at an animal hospital, pharmacy. The job became a very important place for me to learn about people. I didn't know it at the time, of course, but it was really valuable to be able to understand like expectations of what you are when you punch in, and the expectations of who you are when you punch out, and how the job kind of carried over into my life. And interacting with people who, they were lifers. I worked at
Right.
Chick-fil-A, and these folks are here. And so it occurred to me, like, I know I was a tourist, but there was something about the job that it gave me access and entryway to personal lives. And I don't think I took that for granted. I've always been relatively curious about human behavior, and I found a lot of it on the job. And so, yeah, now there certainly were jobs. I never worked at a toothpick factory, but I
Right.
would if anybody's hiring.
Right. So was there that rhythm, that disappearance of the self? If you lose track of what you're doing, obviously everything goes off track. So
Yeah.
you just get into a rhythm. It's sort of a meditative feeling. Is that how you
Yeah.
would describe it?
No, I think that's right. And I think, again, I do think that that's relatable. I think lots of hundreds of thousands of people are doing jobs in which, they're checking out a little bit, but,
Mhm.
for a whole host of reasons, this work needs to get done. And, this assembly line processing of the self I think it's familiar terrain. And so
Yeah,
I wanted to, situate my character there. And to me, I just think like a toothpick factory is just cool. I mean, I'm like, I
I
don't
do
know. Here
too.
I am with a tooth, with some of the toothpick factory. So that's it. I mean, there should be some joy in writing, and learning. I learn from my story, as I'm finished it. Even rereading this story for our discussion, there were elements of this that I'm like, oh wow, I didn't even know I was doing that. So for me,
Right.
the story itself is always kind of, I think there's some beauty in that. Selfish one from the writer's point of view, but there are elements of it that I'm learning about myself as I'm going along. But stuff I don't know about, like toothpicks and toothpick factories and tyrants from 300 BC, those things
Yeah.
too are kind of fun to put into a kind of a conversation as I'm moving along.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about the research in terms of the toothpick factory and in terms of the tyrant from ancient times,
Yeah, yeah.
which is
Well,
unbelievable. Unbelievable. When I read about it, I
is
was
it?
like, oh my God, he had
Oh,
3 wives and he had.
oh, you Googled this
Oh,
guy.
I did. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, yeah,
I was not familiar with him and I just could
yeah.
not. It's stunning, really.
Yeah, I know, it's wild, right? I mean, and
Yes.
and it struck me as I'm just it was one of those, like, pieces of literary gold, because
Hmm.
when I had the plays, I knew where I wanted to be. But I mean, for me, what I love about the short stories is urgency and immediacy. And the sooner you introduce trouble, the better. And so I didn't know where my trouble was. And then so my brain started to think in terms of like, well, I mean, here you are with a toothpick. Imagine it, being a tool with which you could create that kind of trouble. And I remember, like, when I was a kid, I remember reading about how Sherwood Anderson died because he swallowed a toothpick. And I mean, did died originally from that, but like it kind of like was a cause of his death. And so I was thought
Right.
that that was kind of a strange way to go, I thought. And so I don't know. Just in doing research of like who has ever died from toothpick,
Uh-huh.
here this guy came up, right?
No
He got
kidding.
these kind. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's purported. Again, none of the records here are a bit shaky, but it's purported that his son poisoned a toothpick, and that he was picking his teeth or whatever, and that was part of the cause of his death. So it was interesting to me. That was just
Funny.
something that I discovered in kind of like going down the rabbit hole, and he just kind of kept. He kept cropping up as like this possible specter from the past that
Right.
could fit into this world that I already created. So that was I already had the world, and he kind of became someone that I discovered. And once I discovered him, I knew now it's not a question of whether or not the character was going to be, part of the narrative, but how can I convincingly render him into the story? So that's kind of how I operate. I always try to look at like, well, is this too far out? Like where is this absurdity, or where am I stretching, plausibility too far? And
Right.
there are certain moments where I'm like, I know I got to have this, so I'm going to do everything else in the story to try to like accommodate this idea. And again, with my style of writing, I kind of look for those moments where they do seem implausible and stretch that plausibility as much as I can. And but there are certain elements I'm like, okay, I will rearrange the story, but this has got to work because again, there was a lot of energy in me thinking about him and thinking about this guy.
I mean, I almost have the chills. I mean, I really do because it just doesn't even seem possible that in this time, at this time in America, that you could come up with him. With him, I mean, he's just absolutely perfect. It's bizarre.
Yeah, well, it's funny because like apparently Machiavelli wrote about him, and so I think in many ways that was in some ways how he was kind of historically kind of situated. So it was. So I'm glad that it resonates with you. Yeah.
Oh my God, it's unbelievable. So as you were crafting it, so now you've got the toothpicks, you've got him, and then what made you then go from that to this group of people who have the idea? And as you know, everyone will have read the story beforehand, so I'm not giving anything away. But all these people who think, okay, the chosen will, survive the toothpick, and I mean all that whole thing.
That's a good question. To me, it really started with just coming up with a logic system that that was sort of centered around a small group of people who were in this isolated echo chamber, and then kind of blowing that up. And so, like, the first thing I had to do is figure out, like, well, what is the logic of the people who work at this toothpick factory, and how have they come to sort of believe in this concept? And I started thinking of this and trying to figure out, like, well, why do they need it? That to me became the bigger question. Like, why do we need to believe these things that are just really so fringe, these fringe concepts and ideas? And that's when I started doing the work of like trying to think through how a void in our lives can be filled with something that only makes a tiny bit of sense, but you can kind of fervently believe in it, and you kind of get caught up in it, because ultimately that void that is left, or that lack that is in your life, that can be filled in by somebody that has an ulterior motive. And so that to me was like, so I got that made sense to me, but trying to kind of then piece together like the logic of what these people were actually trying to do, it just started to gain momentum in my mind. Well, you have this access to, like, millions of people ostensibly when you're making these toothpicks. And so even though you feel like you're extraordinarily small, you're a cog in a kind of a wheel, if your hands are literally touching, something that's going to then go and go into the mouths of like lots of people, there to me that idea of like individuals who are being able to or are capable of touching large number of people physically, that then kind of translated into like, well, what about psychologically, and what about emotionally? And that's where I started to kind of gather some steam about, like, well, what's going on with this? And then the whole thing for me was really just trying to get Emery right, and again, just to have some empathy for how a person can lose their way, and alcoholism and addiction, and some of like the very real things. Because I think, and I don't want to go too long. I think that there's a level of escapism, right? When we want to believe in a kind of a lizard people, it's escapist. I mean, it's thinking that the world is more interesting and mysterious and dangerous than it actually is. And I think readers believe that too. I think we read in some capacity to enter into another life. So while it's foreign, I don't think it's so unfamiliar that we can't kind of start to make some odd connections between the desire to not be ourselves and to kind of like fall into the trap of somebody else's manipulations.
No, that makes sense to me. So logically, as they're doing this, they think the people who are not poisoned will join the group, right?
Yeah. I think that, well, at least this the subset of them, and sort of like that's what's kind of being passed around. So, and of course, another thing that I'm talking about here is I'm not just looking at the smallness of a town, but I'm also looking at social media, and I think that it's impossible to think about the ways in which conspiracy theories rise and fall without investigating the ways that social media and that echo chamber and that that megaphone that people are given, they can have an effect. And so while we're starting here in the smallness of this space, Tanglewood, it grows, and I think that part of it, the social media and how people are sort of like spinning these narratives around that became the hopefully a little bit more of the escalation of the urgency of the story, and the stakes started to kind of raise a little bit in that regard.
Absolutely. And then, okay, so then we get to the mirror mask and the uprising at the end. And
yeah.
So tell me, because you could read it a million, I think you could read it a lot of different ways. And I think that's actually a strength of the story. So he sees himself in the mirror mask. And I was like, is he the leader? Is he a follower? For a while there, I didn't know. So then I thought, okay, I'm just going to ask you. Ask you. That's the fun of doing these. I could just ask you.
Yeah. I mean,
could have been either. Could have been either a little bit. I don't know.
Well, for me, I for sure, and I appreciate you kind of puzzling through that. Because to me, I think the best part of the story is that you're left with questions at the end of it. I think that's a good thing, specifically about the short story form, that like there are good questions that you're left with at the end of the story, and there are bad questions that you're left with at the end of the story. And so somebody who writes, at least in the style that I do, you have to kind of be cognizant of that. Am I given enough, or is the reader going to be left kind of unfairly treated? And in my mind, for sure, he is this version, like this hypnotist is a version of himself, and this person that he's seen is a rendering or sort of a recapitulation of that version of himself. So no, and I think it's at this point, that Emery has taken the stakes, and he doesn't remember a lot of the things that he's doing because he's blacking out a little bit,
right?
He's sliding a little bit alcoholism, but in my mind, he is a version of Emery, and and as he's following and kind of doing the things that he's doing in this uprising, those are all just versions of himself that are doing it. But I think that, to me, that kind of makes it a little bit less exciting than to think like there actually is this Gothiclean leader who is going to set these people free. That I want there to be. That's the hard part here, is because for this story to succeed, you kind of have to let go of your own belief systems and ride along with somebody who is, a little bit unreliable, to say the least. And so yeah, I think hopefully that's part of the thrill of like parsing through that. And I think, so for me, one of the big challenges of this story was it was never sitting right with me. And when I first wrote this story, it didn't have the bookends here. It didn't have like the beginning of the story and the ending of the story, and it had it positioning him in that jail. So for me, it was never right. It just kind of ended it in that moment. It was too vague. And so I think one of the biggest, changes in this story was that frame that I put around this.
Yes. Yep.
Gave me the opportunity to maybe kind of like, show a version of himself outside of that space of this uprising, if you will, and allowed me to have that beat afterwards. Before the story ended, it just ended on that beat. And so it was a little too amorphous. So this frame allowed me to kind of slow things down at that climax and then back up a little bit before getting to the final scene and the gesture there.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it totally does. And well, then we can go back then and talk about the beginning. I used to receive hundreds of letters addressed to someone who died a long time ago. At first, I let them pile up in a heap, unopened. Eventually, the mountain of mail took over my cramped space. When I couldn't stand the sight any longer, I read them one by one. They were from all over the country by people who wanted me to save them. To a few devotees, I wrote back. I tried to explain how they were wrong, how I was wrong, how everything went wrong. So it was fascinating to me to read that again after reading the story, because the last line is, I turned away from my reflection. Then I took the red strikes from the hypnotist, struck a match, and slid it in with the toothpicks. I did this again and again and again until there was nothing left. So, okay, I always do this at the risk of sounding like really dumb, but I'm going to do it. So, okay, I was thinking, and I wasn't sure, he is sliding into this state of addiction, and he's blacking out and doesn't know what's going on. And yet I thought, okay, well, if he received hundreds of letters, he somehow got other people to go along with him. I mean, if that's real. So meanwhile, while he's completely unraveling, falling apart, he's somehow convincing other people to go along with him. And when he's in jail, he is receiving mail from them.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that's
okay.
right. That's the way
okay. Because
yeah.
Okay.
I think that in my rendition of this, he sets the toothpick factory is going to catch fire, and those people that do have this belief system, they kind of in some ways position him as as a Gothicles in many ways. He becomes that epicenter for their thoughts and their philosophies of these people machines, and so he becomes a minor hero, in a short span of time. And I think he is trying to sort of like work through how he has become this person who is sort of emblemized as the leader of this, half-baked notion. And so the only way to do it for him was really to go to jail. And so like, when he ends in jail, that gives him a chance to, it really is the best place for him, because like the all of the different ways, all the different versions of himself that he was having real trouble, like, being part of. Like he wanted to be a good husband. That didn't work out, right? For a whole host of reasons. But he wanted to be a good father. But, even when he was, recovered, he still was kind of sucking at it, and he wanted to have a good job, but, he's fired. So there's all these things that he wanted to be. And I think in this case, I don't know that he wanted to be a Gothiclean, but he was kind of like, there were those out there that kind of took him because in many ways of these impulses that he has, and they took advantage of that. So I do think there are a lot of people that will hoist somebody up because there's a belief system around this concept. So yeah, that's exactly what happened. He became this person, that at least because they arrested him in large part, that was why they can now see him as somebody who was successful. And so I think that there was this like, this desire to, these support, these followers to like say like, look, I think you did the right thing. I believe in your version of that. But this is a stage of his life when the story opens where he's trying to explain that he didn't. Of course, nobody wants to hear that. It's too late now. He was a cog in this conspiratorial wheel.
It is amazing, and it's wild to think about the fact that someone might, people have this this interiority that no one knows about. They don't know what's going on in the mind of their chosen leader. We're running out of time, darn it. And I have all these follow-up questions. We haven't mentioned, I'm just going to shoot some quick questions right before we have to go.
I'll answer them quickly.
Okay. Ulrich, what's his role in the story?
Yeah, Ulrich is sort of the ghost of Christmas future. Here's a version of a man that is a local. He's lived here. He knows this place. You can't come into my space and act like you know a thing, because you don't. And so he's the one that has put a stake in the ground of this world, and he is gonna in some ways kind of manipulate, try to guide this person who he sees as weak into the position of being someone who believes in this conspiracy theory. So he, in my mind, was the tour guide for the dark stuff that the story is going to explore.
Right. Okay. And where did you get the whole idea of the mirror mask or the reflective mask? Is that a trope I wasn't aware of, or did you?
I just made that up. I mean,
I love that. I love that.
Well, when I started trying to think about the logic of this, the moment I put that toothpick in that Ziploc in the beginning, I knew there was going to be a match in there at one point too. And so I mean, again, like I said, my goal here is to take trouble and to escalate that trouble and to push it to whatever space I can that will maybe kind of push the reader outside of comfort zones. And so for me, then, like, well, what else about it? And so it's not a coincidence. I mean, I wrote this sort of in COVID time, and we're all wearing masks, and there's something dehumanizing about that, even as we're trying very much to protect ourselves. And I think that for a couple of years of wearing masks all the time, I started looking at people differently, and I looked at them without some of the expressions that I've obviously grown used to. So the mask was also just, to me, it made sense because it was something I was actually wearing. And so I don't know, that it's not that I was cognitively trying to kind of bring COVID right into the story, but masks were on my mind. And so I tried to, and they really are so easy to kind of create. And also, of course, there's anonymity when we're wearing a mask. So I wanted that too, right? Like all the different masks that we wear as we transition from the different people that we are, right? That, to me, thought I could kind of gain some of that. Again, my move always, Kelly, is to try to use something physical to kind of capture that emotional stuff that I'm after. And that physicality, to me, it seemed something that a reader might be able to understand, or at least, because we've been living with masks.
Yeah. And I was also thinking that that's something that people do a lot too. They look for something reflected back at them that they identify with or understand. And so we're
Yeah.
always, in a way, looking for some sort of reflection of ourselves. So
I don't
I,
think there's any question about that.
yeah,
I think that's right. We want to find versions of ourselves. I mean, it's this tribalism that we kind of slide a little bit further and further into, and there's a huge danger in that. Not that I'm trying to make this polemical, but for
yeah.
sure, I look at that as dangerous. And the more we're susceptible to not seeing others as empathetic and fully formed, the less chance we have, I think, of getting out of the mess that we're finding ourselves in from time to time.
Oh, it's so true. And the part where he is drinking the beer or the what he thinks is the non-alcoholic beer and turns
Yeah,
out to be actual beer
yeah.
was kind of a jarring moment. Just I've known so many people in my family, et cetera, who've been in addiction, and that's one of those dreams that
Mm.
people have, or nightmares, like, oh, I wake up and I'm using again, or
Yeah.
so that was just I just wanted to say something about that section because it's so effective
I think
and
it's
that
really hard.
yeah.
I think it's very hard, and I'm very fortunate that luckily I don't have the disease. So,
Hmm.
but it is in my family. It's in a lot of people's family, and the smallest step can just really just change everything else in your lives. And there's real sadness in it, and I was trying to parse through some of that sadness that I felt, in the loss of my father, and
Yeah.
so some of that stuff kind of came through, and so that's where that scene was kind of born out of that a bit.
Well, and that Sarah and the boys, that really humanizes him, and the fact that like a moment like that where he's not even really cognizant of what he's doing can
Yeah.
ruin, they'd been on a upward trajectory and then it was
Yeah.
over after that. So, all right, I know we're out of time, but let me ask you, is there anything I didn't ask you that you thought you'd want to talk about for sure in this story?
Oh, no, definitely not. You covered a lot of ground there. I hope I answered some of those things. I realize that this story has a pretty high conceit. It's that I'm asking a lot of the reader. My hope is always that it's grounded by a few scenes that can humanize and kind of pull a little bit at our thoughts, including that one. Just trying to think of in terms of like for me, I think that the moment that I worked on probably the most was the moment where, Sarah talks about how there's this intruder sitting at the edge of her bed. And,
Yes. Oh
that
my
was in
gosh.
many ways the moment of the story where I wanted to kind of, see like there's some real danger here. There's something that's, unsettled about that. So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's not that I
Well,
wanted to talk.
talk about that for a second because he doesn't even realize what's happened there. So tell me how
Yeah.
you work through that really quick.
Yeah, this was one of those strange things, Kelly, that was true, right? So my
Hmm.
mom told me about a time in which she woke up and my dad was this is after they'd been divorced and he was sitting there at the edge of the bed. So that was born out of the
Wow.
truth, actually. Yeah, not a whole lot of here is true, but that one was.
Yeah.
And so, in her telling me that story, it gave me a better sense of some of the things maybe that she was undergoing that I
Hmm.
as a kid sleeping in the other room and had no idea about. And so that to me that was a little bit at the epicenter of the heart of the piece. And again, I guess that's what I'm saying, that if there's enough moments of those moments that are like really like important emotionally to me, then some of the other stuff hopefully it's worth the time to read and kind of pick through and try to work through as a reader.
Well, absolutely. It was very poignant, and I felt so much empathy for him, and it did not come across as didactic at all. It just was a beautiful story. So I think you did a really great job of balancing everything. And what are you working on now?
Yeah, I've got a novella that will be coming out in fall of 24. So we're just now kind of wrapping it together. So it's going to be a book that's got four authors in it, myself and three other writers, and it's a book of novellas. It's called Proper Imposters is the name of the book. So I'll send you a link when it comes out at some.
That sounds so great. And I will update the blog at that point so people can look on there for it as
Cool, thank
well.
you.
Okay, thanks.